Welcome to Friday night's video and our Master Series. This is the 71st video in our Master Series and the second video in our Mixing Concepts. In this video, if you watched the last video, that you know that when we went through the editing phase, we did a little bit of arrangement. And then at the end of first phase processing, we did some doubling of tracks, some panning and some things like that, and we addressed some issues. That was in 66, 67, and 68. And I do suggest you go back and review those videos. But in this first video, or actually second video on Mixing Concepts, we want to address a really important concept, and that is blending or identity preservation. This may sound ridiculous and very obvious, but you really need to make a decision on what you're trying to do, because I'll give you an example. That example is the best way to show you this so that you can get a little bit better understanding of this, is that to make a decision when you're starting to mixing, when you're first starting to get into mixing, is that this really needs to be taken into consideration, because the first concept is I'm blending, which basically blending works out to using the instruments as sound sculpting. So basically it's almost like using, let's say I've got this oboe and this cello and this oboe, and I'm going to be blending them together to try to come up with this sound as the obocello that is got characteristics of both of those instruments, but I'm using the characteristics of both those instruments that I've liked to create this new sound that's an obocello for something I'm doing. Bah, something that I don't want them distinct, and I don't want them to preserve their identity. I'm using parts of each one of them to make this new sound that's an obocello, that's a concept of blending them, and it's almost like sound sculpting. It's almost like sample synth, work, that you're blending those two samples together to create up a new sound instead of preserving their identity. And that's a very simple concept. So if you're trying to do that, you're basically got this oboe or this cello here, and you've got this oboe back here, and the first thing that you're trying to do is that you may be re-equalizing, as an example, just one process. You might be re-equalizing that cello, listening to it, bringing the oboe up into it with your volume until it starts to blend into it, and then going back and re-EQing that cello a little bit, and then go back and re-EQing that oboe a little bit until they blend together in a really nice way. That's this obocello that's got this really nice texture and sound that when the listener listens to it, even if they're both panned off right, the cello's panned 70% right and the oboe's panned 68% right, that they're almost right on top of each other, that the listener doesn't perceive a cello and an oboe, they perceive a obocello. Because if you go back and listen to both those tracks or both those groups by themselves, that they ain't gonna sound that good by themselves, because all the great work you've done on them to make them sound good as individualities, now that you're changing to blend them together to come up with this ba-ba-ba obocello sound over there on the right hand side, that you don't want to distract the listener. You've also got this vocalist that's going, and then we go, and you want him focused on that, with the background guys behind him going, and we go, and you got the obocello that's behind him that's ba-ba-ba, and you really don't want to spend all this time on their distinct identities as much as blend them together into this new sound that's the obocello, that's adding this really cool texture and sound, that you've used those two instruments together to sculpt together to come up with that sound. And that's a very simple example of blending and using instruments together and sculpting, because you may go back and start doing some other sound sculpting on the cello and the oboe to where they blend together into this obocello thing, as a really simple example that sounds really great. It's like you can't really hear it as a cello or a oboe, but it's got characteristics of both those instruments. That's obocello, ba ba ba, and it's a really cool sound for whatever trying to produce. That could be very pertinent in like a pop production or an R&B production or maybe a little bit heavier R&B production that's leaning more towards rock pop kind of thing, or even behind some kind of country thing that's like new age country that they just got a bam bam bam, and you got the oboe cello back there that's giving this really cool texture behind the guitar and the vocalist that's really adding this nice rich really cool kind of pop flavor to it, that it's not, you know, cello and oboe that makes it sound symphonic, but more pop, that you've got an oboe cello, bap bap bap. You know, does that make sense? It adds this really cool texture to your production of whatever you might be doing. And so that concept of you taking and experimenting with that, so that you sit down and maybe take different instruments like that, pan them even close to each other, or, you know, when they're panned farther apart, that can get more difficult because you're going to hear the oboe over there and the cello over there. When you can get them, if you got the oboe and cello over there and the oboe and cello over there, you can blend them. But when they're panned off from each other, it gets more difficult to do that. And it's an experimentation because you really need to sit down and rethink the component characteristics of that cello and that oboe by themselves, to what's going to cause them to blend together to make that new obocello sound that's really cool for that break or that transition or that chorus or that verse or whatever you're doing, that you're trying to blend them together to come out with this new sound. That may sound like a waste of time, but it's really not, because those natural sounds blended together and using them like that, you can come out with some really cool sounding stuff that you'll be sitting there listening to, and the listener's going, it's going bap 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 right there, and you're thinking that's the oboe and the cello. The listener's not thinking that's a oboe cello. He's going, that's a really cool, wild, you know, kind of, you know, you've mixed that together and blending those two instruments together. It's this whole new oboe cello sound, and you can have a flute mixed in it with a contrabass, all kinds of things that add this really wild sound that's would be really cool. That doesn't sound symphonic; it sounds more pop. You know, that would be really good support in this production to add, you know, stereo width and depth to the production. That just gives it a much lusher sound and much fuller sound that fills out a whole bunch more of the frequency range, instead of sounding like, you know, a guy with a bass, a guitar, and a singer and a drummer, you know, da 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 da. All of a sudden, it's got this whole new element of obocello, bap bap bap, yeah. But nobody's hearing that. They're hearing that other cool, unique sound, and that may sound really long-winded, but it's a huge technique for you to get it in your head and start practicing with, and to take that in consideration when you're starting to mix. Because if you're trying to do that technique rather than preserve identity, you're going to want to do a lot of different things with them, and you might want to re-EQ them, do the high-low pass filtering on one or the other one, trying to bring out, you know, I mean, it's like the oboe. You might have high pass filtered it, and then you might have boosted it more up around 500 hertz because you're really trying to get some kind of characteristic out of that oboe that's blending with that cello that you've low pass filtered a little bit, and now you're blending them together and fussing with EQ, and you're re-sculpting a little bit to come out with this obocello thing that's this whole new sound that is not an oboe or a cello. It's the obocello that, you know, and it's not even an obocello. It's, you don't really hear an oboe and a cello. You hear this other sound that's this really cool sound that you've sculpted from them in blending and using, you know, that instead of mixing them together as two separate identities, that you've blended them together to come out with something else. And that's a complete different mixing technique that's very valid. That some people might say, well, why would you do that? Well, you mess with it and you experiment with it, it'll become real obvious why you do that, because it can be very, you know, even a pop song. You've got some pad synths and you've got a sax player or a keyboard player that you're really trying to blend them together to where you've got some keyboard sound and pad sound that they're hitting these chords together that's blended together to this pad keys thing, you know, that's behind the bass player and the guitar player in this pop song, you know, that you got the bass player and the pop guy and the bass player and the guitar player panned off to one side, and then in a little bit you've got this pad synth and this keys that, you know, or it's like a piano and a pad synth that are, you know, ba 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 ba, you know, that you've blended together to cause this keypad sound that, you know, they're separate instruments, but they're really starting to sound perceived as one sound, because of their levels. You've really, worked on them and EQ'd them and messed with their levels to where they're perceived as this keypad sound behind the guitar and a bass player that the ba ba ba, or whatever's going on, that's got this really cool rich sound that you're more trying to blend, and you don't want the instrument, the listener, to really go, oh, that's the keys and there's the pad over there. Or you might even put them on top of each other really close together, right and left, to create that sound of blending. So that's a really cool technique. Now, next is that if you're trying to preserve identity is the next technique. So you really need to take that in consideration. You've got the oboe or the cello pan at 70% right, and the oboe pan at 68% right. 70 and 68% right, but you want to preserve their identity. So you've got the cello up front more, so you really don't want to mess with it and start fussing with it, attenuating, boosting it, and trying to EQ it differently. But the oboe over here, not only are you trying to get it some depth, but you want to preserve the sound, so you're going after it with EQ and maybe boosting it around 500 hertz. So even though they're right next to each other over on the right hand side, that the listener can really hear, no, I hear a cello and I hear an oboe. And he's hearing characteristics of the oboe and the cello. Is some characteristics of each one of them that you maybe boosted a little bit with EQ to make them cut out in the mix, so that each one of them are standing out a little bit, so they are preserving their identity. There is lots of work to do on that, and there's lots of sound sculpting you can do on that, different equalization attempts that you're trying to boost areas, in areas to preserve its identity next to the cello, or attenuate other areas that you're causing a blending problem, that are causing a muddiness, that's causing a blending effect that you don't want to happen, because you're trying to make sure the listener can hear identity rather than blending thing happening. And sometimes a little bit of a combination of both of them. And, besides that you want it back a little bit farther. That we'll talk about that in the next coming videos when we start talking about concepts of spatialization, panning, and depth, and things like that. But those basically work out to some more sound sculpting at this point in your mixing that you have to take into consideration. And sometimes you have to take those tracks that you've done all this great editing on and great processing on and reevaluate that and go, well, no, now that I'm doing that, I really need to go do that to it so they blend together more to become this blended thing, or I need to rework some of the sculpting did and equalization I've done on them to help promote their identity standing out in the mix, even if they're right next to each other at 78% right or 70% right and 68% right, because you've got this huge production going on, that you've got lots of space, that you have to have this, it's sectioned up, your panning that much and subdivided so that everything has its own panning place. That's a work in progress. Both of those techniques are something you need to make note about. Think of them as valid mixing techniques and then experiment with them. How are you going to get that done? How are you going to blend them together so you got the oboe cello happening? Or how are you going to do a little bit of different EQ work on them or something like that, or some other type of sculpting to make that oboe stand out from that cello even though they're standing right next to each other, so the listener hears either that blended thing happening, the oboe cello, bap, 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 or they hear violin cello. Because, the cello might be, doing some kind of, going up, da, 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 and the oboe might be coming down, da, 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 and you don't want them blended together, and even if they might be going dot, dot, dot together, that you want the listener to go, yeah, I really hear a cello there and an oboe right next to it, bro. You did such an awesome job mixing that, because I can hear both of them distinctively. And really, you basically went through and attenuated and boosted in some areas with the EQ, maybe as a simple example, to make each one of them, characteristics of each of them, stand out so the listener would hear. Some of the definitive characteristics of the oboe standing out and some of the definitive characteristics of the cello standing out, so they are very definitive, being heard rather than blended together. So that can get very complicated, but basically the understanding of it is to take those two mixing concepts into your mind as very valid and very huge tools to when you start to mix, and define which one of those you're trying to do. And sometimes you might be doing them differently in different sections of songs because of what's happening in different transitions and different movements. So peace, hope, love. I certainly hope you take a look at those two different types of mixing techniques, evaluate them, and practice with them. And I'll see you in the next video when we address the next mixing technique.